Hi, I'm Dustin Luecke.
And I'm Candace Price. This is another edition of Hometown Conversation.
We're working to bring together community members to talk freely and openly about ways we can make effective, positive change in our community.
Yes, we want to be a platform of education, understanding, and empathy.
We have with us today Brandon Sydnor and Kat Sletten, activists in the community who are with us to talk about their role and how we can learn from current events. And we were just talking a moment ago about how we document these sorts of things because we don't want to repeat it. But we're sitting in a situation again where there's been another situation in Kenosha, Wisconsin, another police shooting of a black man. I know it's kind of a dark place to start, but start from there. How are you feeling?
It is, it's one of these things, and I think that I think in an area like this, in a predominantly white community, what you have to understand is these conversations are constantly happening in the black community. So when this happens, for the white community, it is like a shock. But for me to see it, I'm like, well, here we are again. And the thing is we are going to keep being here until I don't care where you live in this nation, every community has to take a stand and say, all right, we are going to look at police reform. We're going to figure out how to be preventative in these nations. We're going to think about how we can retrain officers so that we're not having these instances happen, because they should not be happening. They just shouldn't. They shouldn't be happening if you're black. They shouldn't be happening if they're white. It just shouldn't be happening. But when we keep ignoring it, and I get this comment in this specific area a lot, where they'll say, well, we haven't had an incident like that, so we don't need to think about police reform. We do have racism in this area, though. And so that makes this area a ticking time bomb. And so to say that it takes a life from the black community to spur this community to do something is very disrespectful, honestly, because we shouldn't have to pay these prices in our lives, and we shouldn't be negotiating in black lives. Like, it should be, when we notice that there's a problem, our leaders in our community, the immediate response should be, what can we do to prevent this from happening here? That should hands down be the response.
Yeah, if I may piggyback off of what you were saying, Kat, in my personal opinion, when it goes to addressing an issue with George Floyd, or with his name passes my Jacob Blake.
There are always so many.
There's so many of them, exactly, and with situations, especially in a community like this, I find that maybe there's a mental distancing that's happening between people realizing that yes, there are black people, black lives, people of minority, people of color being killed in our communities. Not necessarily being killed, but experiencing that racism, that level of inhumanity that people place on them. I find that there's a disconnect between, I guess I'm going to say, the white community thinking that because, sure, I have a black friend and he seems fine, or I know this black family, so-and-so, this family of color over here, and they seem to have a good life, they're stable, they have children, a family. But what they're not looking at is all the other people, the students at the schools who are dealing with racism and indifference from their teachers, the school resource officers. Yeah. We have police officers going to schools, asking students questions and interrogating them. That's a type of mental break that people aren't realizing. Would you think that that's okay to go, would you want your child, your white child, to be questioned by a black police officer over some event that they went to outside of school? Of course not. So why is it that somehow that's flipped, that it's okay, that we can have our minority students being targeted like that in places where they're supposed to feel safe?
And I think that really goes off of how we define racism in this area. Because of the country's history of racism, we always want to qualify it as whether or not it's racist enough to create noise over it. So even when we look at black students being in schools and what they're experiencing with the school resource officers here in this community, the almost response is like, well, we let you be in our schools. Like, what more do you want from us? Like, we've let you attend here. There was a time that you weren't even allowed to be here, so you should just be grateful that you're in the doors. And it's like, that mentality is so oppressive. You have no idea what that does to a child, having to consistently grow up in that. And like you have not put your hands on that child yet, but you have hurt that child and caused a lot of trauma in them just for letting that mentality grow in that space. And that does affect how they even learn in that environment, or what their motivation is in that environment. And we do that even here when, there are just so many things. I look back even, and not even just within the Black community, this issue with the statue was and I think like ridiculous. The biggest, the thing for me is, you have the statue that has, from its beginnings, been told by the Native people in this area, have been saying, we don't like this. This does not represent us. This is a poor caricature. It is not honoring us. Like, it needs to not happen. Like, we know that that's really the true history of this statue. And we get to a point, finally, where, they've got the win, they're going to be able to remove it. And I will never forget the feeling of when Jessica Olsen came out with this idea that, no, we leave it up. It's folk art now. We've decided, the white community has decided it's folk art. We don't really care what you guys have to say about that. And we'll think about building something else for you guys. And this idea that we can negotiate in racism, and that if we give you something, like, you should just be grateful then that we are offering you, to do this other thing, and let us just keep our racism because we like it. And that is like such a, and again, I'm so glad that that was taken down, but again, the damage it does when our leaders act this way is irreversible. Like, it is hard. Like, that community now, just from those words that she inflicted on them, that had to hear that. That's so detrimental. And it happens with the Black community here as well. It happens with the Hmong community here as well. And people aren't realizing how because it's not just one instance, it's a repeating. And then you get to be my age and you're 30 and you have to relearn all of these things, and it's hard.
Kat, you were mentioning right at the beginning that this is something that people of color, and especially Black people, have always talked about.
Yes.
But one of the reasons it's getting so much attention right now is because we have these video recordings. And I mean, there's been a lot of debate of why do we need to see this violence and bloodshed on camera to believe people of color when they say they're experiencing this violence. And I just wanted to get your take on this new revolution being televised. It's not new, but how people are like, yeah, it's new. And we have these new activists and it's all televised, and we wouldn't believe otherwise. Just from both of you to hear your response to, is that helpful? I mean, I guess in a way it is, but it's also kind of painful, I think.
It is a fine line. And I think what people have to understand is that, so like for me, I have not watched the video of Jacob Blake. And I won't. I don't want to. And the reason is like I have seen that enough. And I don't need to personally see the video to understand that happened and to recognize that it's not a surprise to me that it has happened. I don't need that reinforcement. I think that it does need to be documented, kind of like when Brandon was talking about, because a lot of times the Black community is not believed when this happened. Had there not been a video of it, the narrative would have just been, it would have been like all the different reasons why it was acceptable for this officer to shoot this man in the back in front of his children. Because the video is there, people are able to see what that interaction was. And what's crazy is you will still have people who will say, well, we need more information on this. And that's crazy to me because, and I don't know who started this idea, but this is America, and in America we have a justice system. And when it comes to the death penalty, that is not decided by officers. They don't get to make that choice whether or not a person lives or dies. So it does not actually matter. I don't need to hear what Jacob Blake did, or what Jacob Blake did, and I don't care. Because it was not that officer's right or part of his job description to shoot him 7 times in the back. End of. But we have these, we have people who, they're not going to believe just that Black experience. Like, they do have to just see it. And it sucks that that's the point that we're at, but that is. And to understand why we're at that point, you really have to go back to the beginning of our history in this country, of how we've been portrayed as Black people You know, we have been portrayed in the media as untrustworthy, or always doing something wrong, or always deserving of this. We're not polite, we're not clean, there are all these things that are associated with the Black community, media-wise and through stories, and always have been since we've been here. And in an area like this, where you're not seeing Black people regularly, you're not exposed to that diversity, it is so easy then to let those biases take control because you've never seen anything contrary. You've never seen anything different.
Yeah, and Brandon, I mean, we talked about this just moments ago with you being a videographer for a lot of the events that go on in La Crosse here. How important is that, piggybacking off of Candace's question, to provide that context?
It is beyond important, in my opinion. History often shows us that the victors write the history. In the past, when these things were being documented, like when racism was being, enacted against Black people, against minorities, very often the people who would write those history books were white people. And so it would be tailored, say, well, this group of people, this group of degenerates, these dirty, nasty people were up in arms fighting over some stupid thing. Whereas nowadays, Bob, Schmo, Bill, me, John has a phone. We can all, I guess we're all the winners of history in that aspect. I can very easily take out my phone and videotape an experience that I had at Quick Trip, where a lady came up to me and was not very kind. The other day, I didn't tell you about this. That was very strange. And I then went and had a conversation with one of my coworkers, and I told them that this happened. They didn't believe me. They were very in denial that, like, well, no, that doesn't happen. That doesn't happen here, especially where we are. And I told, well, I'm telling you right now, as a Black man, my experience, this happened. What more evidence do you need? I need to see it. And he told me that, and I said, okay. So I guess in going with that, people don't often find truth in things unless they have that picture evidence, that video evidence. Going by word of mouth is only good for so far. It's good for me and Kat, for me and you, when we have that repertoire, that connection. But if I'm going to go do some research on a genocide that happened in another country, I have less of a connection to that history, that experience. This way, I feel we all have that connection to what we document, to
really show that.
To really show that these things happen.
And it's hard because...
And it's not that far away.
Yeah.
It's not that far away. It's right here. I could go on and on about all the experiences that I have had here in La Crosse recently, too. I can think of 3 of them that have happened in this last 2 weeks, of where racism, I've seen it, it's happened to my face, and I've had to respond to it on the job and out, just buying groceries and things like that. It happens here, and it's sad, and it's scary a lot of the time to think that there's not people who believe that. So I guess in what I'm doing is I'm making people believe. I'm showing them the evidence. Here it is. This is what's happening. Do something about it.
And how is that to go through life having to have that? I mean, not being able to just say, I'm not trying to cause problems, this happened to me, and not being able to rely on that.
It's terrifying.
Demoralizing.
It's demoralizing. I went to, where I grew up, it was a majority very white, and so I did have some Black friends, but like if I ever had a problem with like any students, if I was ever bullied, I could not go to my teachers and let them know that this was an issue, because I know that if I ever went to them, they would be, oh, well, just get over it, or that's not really a problem, that didn't really happen, you're lying. It would be always, you're lying, didn't happen, we need proof, evidence, and things like that. So maybe that's something that was beaten into my head, that if I do say something bad happened, I have to back it up. I have to be able to provide evidence. The benefit of the doubt is not on me, I guess, in this
And it's also like
instance.
like Brandon said, it's scary, because I think what people don't understand is in this area, especially in this area, when you're growing up in an area that is predominantly white, you have that underlying racism there, and you don't have that like Black community support because this area is not diversified. That idea that people aren't going to believe you, I mean, it is a really real thing, and it does, like, it influences even how you grow up. I mean, like growing up when I was in like school and high school, this is Wisconsin, and let's not kid ourselves. A big part of what high schoolers do is they do start, that might be the first time that they try drinking, or they do like a bonfire at a place, or they do like things like that. I never did any of those things. Like, I could not afford to do anything. It was a big fear of me. I did not try any of those things until I graduated from high school, because I knew that if, like, we were in a situation and we got caught and they all said, oh, well, Katrina's the one that brought it, it would not matter what I said. My life was, like, that was it. That was what was going to be written down. That was going to be in my record. I couldn't have that inherent trust that my friends wouldn't use that to their benefit. And so I didn't, you know, I have, like, my one best friend in high school, and we didn't, like, we read Harry Potter and hung out at her farm. And that's what we did, and it was great and it was fun. But it's an part of growing up that I can't relate to. You know, and I'm never going to be able to, because that wasn't something that I could do. You know what I mean? And even now, as an adult, like Brandon said, you know, I can sit here and I can have a conversation with someone. I can have a conversation even within my own family. Like, I've had that conversation with family members on my mom's side, which is my white side, where I have been like, where they will literally say to me, like, racism does not exist. And I'll have to be like, you have been with me. You were with me when we were children at the Toma Cash store, and they would not let me in.
Why do you think that they don't see it as racism, that it exists?
Is it because of the word, do you think? I mean, just that connotation that comes with it.
I think it is how we portray racism. So we like to, even if you look in the history books, when we talk about racism, even when we're teaching our kids in school, racism is a burning cross and a white hood, and it's segregation, and that's it. And when we ended segregation, we ended racism. That's the narrative that's in history books. So when I say this is racist, they say, where was the white hood? Where was the burning cross? You were allowed in the building. None of this is racist. And we don't want to delve into these deeper conversations. And it's like, that isn't, you know, and again, we talked about earlier, this idea of, I should be happy to be in this space because I'm not, you know, you're not enslaved. You don't have to use a different water fountain. Like, you should just be happy with what you have. And I'm like, but you know what? No, it's not enough. Because I know that we could live in a world without this. Like,
Sorry.
Yeah, so I really think that it is how we are taught about racism.
Yeah, that's one of the things that I personally struggle with, having those conversations with, like, some of my closer friends and things like that, is, I guess, getting them to recognize that racism is not going to look like a hood and a burning cross on your front porch all the time.
Yeah, that's not how it always looks.
Sometimes it looks like that weird comment. I want that black person over there to help me, right? I don't like those kind of people over there. Or can you really do that as good as that person can? It's small microaggressions like that that
they
really
lead to the big ones, and
they
that's what people
seriously
don't understand.
do.
They
And
are ticking time bombs.
They are, and since they're not as like a big show of like, well, I hate you, they're smaller, people get away with it very, very easily. It's just nodded off as, well, it wasn't that bad, just like, get over what they said, it's okay. Like, they didn't really mean anything by it, and that's just not true. They meant it just as much as if they're gonna go burn a cross on your front porch, and which has happened to my father. He's had the KKK knock at his door. And is that hatred different than the hatred that I get at work? It's not. It comes from the same place. Somebody else is just willing to go do something more with it, I guess.
Yeah, and I think another thing that we have to really understand is that, and something that we do not want to address in this country, but this country has honestly worked very hard at making racism very comfortable. So to address it is a very uncomfortable experience. So when we want to sit down and have this conversation where I point out to someone, hey, this is why what you just did was racist, here's where this is coming from, and this is why it needs to change, that's an uncomfortable experience that they have never had to deal with, because racism is not talked about in that way. It is so much easier to be then dismissive of me. And because we live in a society that really promotes that dismissiveness, there's nobody that's going to check you. So you can very easily, you know, that person at work for Brandon can very easily tell to Brandon, well, I didn't see it, so it didn't happen. And then he can then go talk to his white friend to say, oh, there was this black guy at my work who was complaining about this.
It cascades.
And and they said, oh, well, did he have a video? No, he didn't even have a video, so I know it didn't happen. And they're like, oh, yeah, you're right, it didn't happen. And now and so not only have we dismissed Brandon, but that person has gone on into other circles and reinforced the stereotype that already exists, that black man can't be trusted. So now we have and now we're having a whole nother cycle of conversations.
But there's like these levels, right? Because you're talking about these microaggressions and these forms of racism that happen every day, but then we have George Floyd, we have this systemic racism. So as activists, where do you start with all of it?
You have to start at the beginning. You actually have to, a lot of times people, they want to ignore these microaggressions. But you can't. You have to start at them and work your way up, because the reason George Floyd is happening, the reason Breonna Taylor has happened, is because these microaggressions have been allowed to flourish unchecked.
They
build that platform. And so then when you have a person in power who then abuses their position and they kill somebody, you have an entire society who has grown up with these microaggressions, so that when they hear, he was shot in the back 7 times, their immediate response is, what was he doing?
Why
because
was he
they
resisting?
have that platform, and they have been taught that that's what they need to ask. In the same way they've been taught to ask Brandon, well, what were you doing? In the same way, we teach that constantly. So it's not, we like to think about this as this huge leap, but we have to understand that it's not actually a huge leap. We've built the scaffolding for it. We've built the ladder. So to reach and ask, Breonna Taylor's family, well, what was she doing sleeping in her bed? It's just like twisting the light bulb after already walking all the way up the steps. You're not stretching at all. It's that easy to make that distinction.
It's a choice that people don't want to do, because again, they're not comfortable with it. They're comfortable with maintaining that level of their own level of comfort. Ignorant bliss.
It is so much easier to live in a society, I imagine, I never have, but from what I've experienced with my peers, it seems very blissful to envision, La Crosse as this area that, we help our neighbors, and we wave on the street, and we do those things.
We're a community thing. I've just recently gotten blocked from posting in the You Might Be From La Crosse Facebook page, again. And I never post anything politically themed, but that's what they always tell me. It was just how I feel that here, as us as a community in La Crosse, need to come together and support each other for times like this. And it was removed and blocked, and it's every single time.
It's just this automatic, and so it is these kind of little things. And a lot of times when I had these conversations, people do want to be defensive and say, look at the great things La Crosse has. And I'm like, I love those things as well. That is why I love this area. That's why I fight so hard for this area, because there are things that I just really love, and I really do love the people, and I really do believe in this community. But that does not change the fact that one of the times I was at the park with my children, with other moms and other peers, an officer came up to me and asked me what I was doing there, because they did not think that I belonged in that neighborhood, because it was kind of a nicer park, I guess, was the thing. So I had to show him my ID. I'd explained to him what I was doing there. That is humiliating. And this was only a few years ago. And then do you think that I then, we talk about how to, include diversity. Do you think that I then felt that park was a safe spot for me and my kids to be? Absolutely not. Well, kid at that time, we just had Nadia. But absolutely not, because that was a scary experience. And, and I had immediately, when I talked about it, I had people say, well, you can tell them that you don't legally have to show them your ID. And I'm like, my life has to, because if I don't just comply with whatever it is an officer here wants, regardless of how humiliating it is for me, that is putting my life and the life of my child on the line. And my biggest fear is at one point, because everyone does, when I look at what with Jacob Blake and him just turning away and walking away, it was that breaking point where you're just I just don't care anymore, and I'm just going to walk away. And my greatest fear, is waiting for when I myself get to that point, and then what's going to happen then. That is a real fear. And it's, it is, when we talk about privilege, it's a privilege that this is not something that your average white person thinks. They do feel very comfortable saying to an officer, you can't ask me that. I'm not going to say that to an officer ever until I get to that point. And then I'll probably be the statistic, and then you guys can have a vigil for me and say her name and say Kat Sletten, and we can go on from there, because that's a real thing that I have to deal with every day.
I think it's interesting. You just hit on something that really registered with me, that idea that we've talked about this in a previous hometown conversation like this. Me as a white man, especially being able to sit with that discomfort, because I think when I hear the term racist, you think of, like you said, the white hood, the burning crosses, and being lumped in with those people. But just being able to be comfortable with the idea that there are different levels of this, and it's not necessarily actively contributing to it, that you're still contributing to it. So I guess, what advice do you have for this community to be able to better sit with that, to address the discomfort of recognizing it?
I think the first thing is just recognizing that this is something that we are all dealing with right now. You don't have to feel alone in this process. Everyone in the nation and within this community is learning how to unlearn these racist tendencies. Okay, you're not going solo. You are going to make mistakes in this. But just recognize that when somebody does, when I point that out to somebody, I'm not trying to humiliate them and make them feel bad. It's because I truly believe in them and say hey, listen, me and you, we're mom friends. We go out for coffees, we do smoothies, we do play dates with our kids. I really like you. I'm letting you know this because I truly care about you as a person. Here's how you can better in your growth.
Just not seeing that as a criticism of us as a person.
It's not this thing, because we take it to that extreme place. We want to take it as this idea of then we are just this horrible person that just has no right to live or something like that. And it's that's not the conversation I want to have. You do have, everyone has good qualities. You're great. But we need to work on this. I need you to be open to that conversation. And if I have put myself out there, if any Black person has put themselves out there to educate you on this topic, understand that has taken a very great mental toll on my health. So I would not do that if I didn't truly care about you.
I agree. Yes. I guess my big piece of advice would be that we all need to realize that we're all just people floating on a giant rock through space. A big thing for me is to educate yourselves on some of the history of these struggles that minorities go through. Anybody who struggles, learning their history and learning what you can do to help them, going out and asking your friends, asking your community members, your family, anybody who's ever experienced trouble of any kind, they're going to be a good firsthand knowledge source of how you can do it better, how you can either support them more, how you can make a change in your community, in your own personal lifestyles. Just realizing that there's always so much more to learn and so much that we can be doing as people to better benefit everybody as a humanity.
And expand your horizons, do read, do find Black characters in different venues. I talk, as a teacher, I talk with other teachers a lot. You don't need to show Black people only as Harriet Tubman.
Right.
You can show them going to the library. You can show Black joy.
There's a lot of good literature out there.
Yeah, of just having fun. I recommend to parents, make sure your kids have access to those things, those TV shows where you're just seeing Black people living and being happy and just doing nice things. Have those things, and then make sure you have that for yourself. And if you look around your circle of friends, you really should be trying to cultivate a circle of friends that is diverse, because those are the things that make us better people, is when we have these different experiences with different people and hear those different stories. And so if you look at your friend circle and you look at, the people in your life and you recognize, oh, I really have nobody there, expand that circle. It's okay to be all right, what spaces can I go to make these connections? Because I promise you, we are very nice. I will be your friend.
You'll invite them to the barbecue, or
right? I'll be listen, let's do this. I am definitely open to that.
Just having a dialogue so we can.
One of the things my grandpa said recently is he's never seen the marches that he used to be an activist, and he's just I've never seen such a worldwide attention. So my question to you all is, are we headed in the right direction, or where do you have a sense of where we're headed, and is that in the right direction right now?
I think slowly but surely,
yes.
We are headed in the right direction. One of the things that I have to come to terms with for myself is I don't believe that I'm going to see all of the results that I need to see in my lifetime. That's something that's deeply saddening and frustrating. But at the same time, that doesn't stop me from realizing that the world's not just for me. So I have to keep going and fighting for the people who come after me. I think
that's an existential reality we all
It is.
struggle
Yeah,
with.
where you're like,
as long as humanity's around, that's going to be a problem. So until we can cure humanity, for lack of a better word, I think we're going to continue to deal with these things in whatever form they might show up. Maybe not blatantly as racism or as like homophobia or transphobia or any type of phobia that we have towards another person, but in like the small
It'll take generations to wheedle that
a generational shift.
Yep.
Yeah.
And I do think I am very happy with the direction that we're going. Having grown up in this area, I never thought I would see any sort of like the first time I saw that anyone was doing something for George Floyd, I was like in lacrosse. Like I was like very proud. Like I was so proud. So I do think that this is a great first step. I think that that's the big thing, is making sure people understand that this is the first step in order to create real change. We have to have leaders in positions of power willing to create those policies. And this is not an issue of Democrats or Republicans or anything like that. It is, I don't care who you like to vote for. What I'm asking is for you to take the person whom you like to vote for and to really question them on what their ideas are for police reform, to really question them about how they plan on bringing more diverse learning and in history into the school system, like how they are implementing anti-racism in their cabinet, like to really ask them these things, because I'm telling you, it does not matter what side of the fence you're on. Everybody needs to learn how to do this. Everybody needs to learn how to do this. So if people are willing to continue with those steps, we're going to be looking great. If people want to just put a hashtag and raise a sign and then be done, nothing will change. It's not possible for it to change. So I'm really kind of counting on the community to start holding leaders in the community accountable, because that's when we talk about how you can help the community. That's the other biggest thing. Start asking, our leaders, what are we doing? And if they don't know what to do, that's fine. But guess what? There are people in this community who do know what to do, and you can ask us, and I will more than tell you what I think you should do.
We'll give you the resources, the connections, we'll introduce you to anybody you might need to know. Just come find us.
So as long as we keep that faith and that momentum, we're going to be great. And I love this city. I have the utmost faith in us. I really do.
Yeah, and you talk about the first step. We've heard from Police Chief Sean Cadron talking about how they've set up the transparency page, and that he said in the virtual town hall meeting held just this past week that is only a first step. So I guess, how confident are you? Have you had these conversations with leadership locally, and how confident are you that the talk will translate?
I think that the biggest issue that I have when talking with kind of like leaders is, again, kind of going back to our previous discussion, where there are things that I say, this is something we need to do. If we look at things like from Campaign Zero and stuff, like I'll say this is something that needs to happen. And there is this willingness, and again, what I want to bring is how comfortable people are with dealing with racism. It is one thing to kind of put a transparency page on a website. It is quite a different conversation to discuss creating a citizen review board that would handle police complaints. Those are two very, very different discussions, and it pushes us into more uncomfortable positions. Are the leaders of La Crosse ready to have those really uncomfortable conversations? I think that that's really up for debate at this point.
I personally don't think so.
Yeah, I think it is something, again, I think that it's something that the citizens of La Crosse are really going to have to push for and kind of create that environment of saying, like, no, we are having this conversation. It is going to be uncomfortable, but we are going to do it, because we almost have to create that space to have that dialogue.
Yeah.
So it's like, again, excited for first steps, but recognizing that these next steps that we have to take, they are going to be challenging and they are going to be uncomfortable, and if we want this change and we want to build a better La Crosse, that's what we need to do. It just is.
What are you thinking?
Just going off that, maybe playing devil's advocate a little bit, but what would you say to those who say that by doing these virtual town halls and getting together with members of the Black community, they're opening that to dialogue and going forward.
La Crosse has had many a conversation, and so a lot of times the Black community, we have a very long memory, and we remember things for a long time. So I can remember a few years ago where, La Crosse, the council got together and they apologized for being a sundown town, and we said, we're gonna make changes. What changes have we seen since then that has made us feel like, wow, we've really been inclusive to other, you know what I mean?
Look at the town anymore?
Yeah, right. But is it? I mean, even
we'll talk about what a sundown town is. I think some people watching may not
don't understand what that is. So a sundown town is a town in which Black people or people of color were not allowed to be in after the sunset. You weren't allowed to be there, and there was a lot of really creative ways. If you go further south, they weren't creative about it at all. They would kill or murder you or beat you to death if you were in their town after that. So they weren't creative about it. In the north, they tended to be a bit more creative, and they used a lot of policies to create that. Policies on how you could have a house, a lot of redlining. La Crosse is a predominantly white area, not because Black people didn't want to be here, but because Black people were not allowed to be here. And that is a very, very big difference. And those same rules and those same mentalities still exist to this day.
Right, so Brandon, you were just saying that it's still, in your opinion, kind of like a sundown town, and it wasn't even that long ago that it stopped being one, technically speaking. Yeah. What was it, the 50s?
Yep.
Too recently.
I think a great example of how this still exists is the recent budget that was just given out by the council over this summer is an excellent example of where we're at. Building the safety complex is going to be pushing people in a lower income area out of that area.
Garbage.
We know what families are renting in that area. So when we build that, when we're given a choice, Jessica Olsen, to her credit, gave the council another option. She said we could shelve this, we could fix the fire department, and we could come back to this later once we've done an impact study and realize how much this is going to impact people. And there need to be 4 votes to make that happen, and there were only 3, and so that will, continue as planned. But when we look at that, we look at what families are affected. Has the city created the affordable housing needed for those families to move into different housing? No. Has the housing market become more affordable for people to buy homes in this area? No. So where are those people going to have to go? They have to move. So when we talk about this, 2 years ago, I bought a house. Me and my husband bought a house. We would have loved to buy a house in La Crosse, but we could not. If we wanted to, in our price range, if we wanted a house in our price range that wasn't a complete fixer-upper, we had to go elsewhere. That's how we ended up in Sparta, and we love the house, and it's great. But I love La Crosse, and the game plan always was we'd start there, kind of build things up, put some savings in, and then come back to La Crosse and buy a house then there. But it's just this was... I was pushed out of the city based on housing. And so when you look at what our local leaders are doing with their budget, if we wanted a diverse La Crosse, we would have one.
What about people, again, devil's advocate, what about people who say, that's more of an income discrimination issue, not
I got you there.
race issue? Because we hear that a lot, right? Yeah. That actually racism doesn't exist. It's more about the difference between being rich and income inequality.
Well, look at the income disparity between races then. Yeah. There is a disparity there. Black people don't make as much money as our white counterparts, no matter what jobs we're doing. So sure, you can look at it that way, that it is an income-based issue, but then you have to look at, why is there an income-based issue?
Yeah.
It goes back to that systemic.
Yeah,
exactly.
Going back.
It's a systemic way of keeping those certain people down, keeping those minorities down.
And so then we go into those conversations of, the school-to-prison pipeline. We go into those conversations of how we look at drug use. You know what I mean? A Black person who uses drugs is a degenerate. A white person who uses drugs needs rehab.
Crack epidemic, opioid epidemic.
Yes, it's we're having these very different conversations, and in the meantime, we are shoving the community down. And so the crazy thing is when you rise above that, it's not considered, and I love how it's framed a lot of times, it's not considered as, wow, we should change all the things that you had to do to rise above it. It's considered a success story
yes.
of why we don't need change, because look, if you work hard enough, you can
You
get
can make
there.
it.
And it's like, I should not, you know, even graduating from Viterbo, the things that I had to do to graduate from there are things no, you know, kid, and like, let's be honest, when you're first starting college or just a kid, should have to do to just get an education. So the fact that I survived that, that's not a beautiful thing. That's really sad. And it shouldn't happen for people. So we have to be willing to, again, have those other conversations about what's going on where we are actually pushing communities, and not just the Black community. We can apply this to a lot of different communities, that are disenfranchised, and creating this, you know, event. We can look at it now just in the homelessness in La Crosse. You know, what has been our solution for homelessness in La Crosse? Has it been to use money to create homeless shelters, use money to help like people who are living with homelessness better their situation, things like that? Or has it been used to ignore the problem? You know, what do we use our tax dollars for?
I want to go back to the issue of policing, law enforcement. Again, it seems like the idea of continuing these conversations is just to push for that change. And I guess from both of you, what do you see the future of community safety look like? And I mean, I know there's a lot of talk about defunding police or changing the way trainings are done. I just, what's your vision for what it should look like?
At this point, I really do feel like there's, you know, it is, you know, policing and the community. Like there are these just two separate kind of entities. And I would really like it to be cohesive. And for that to happen, there needs to be a foundation of trust. So I think that we need to try the things that are going to help to foster the trust. And again, I think that's when we're going to start having very uncomfortable conversations, because what is going to foster trust, you know, for me, from a police officer, you know, when we look at something like, there are things that police officers do within the white community that, you know, are really effective. You know, they might like knock on doors and introduce themselves and things like that, and people are like, oh, that's so sweet and that's great. That's not gonna have the same reaction for me. You know, if an officer knocks on my door and is just like there to like say hi, I'm like,
why are you really here?
So does something like the Neighborhood Resource Officer program not translate then?
So we have to really, so like when we're doing something like the Neighborhood Resource Officer, that has to be done with Black leaders who have the knowledge of that historic trauma and understand how you introduce that to a neighborhood. Because when you don't, you know, the complaints that we're seeing is there is a good portion of the Black community who's not a fan of that, because there's not that trust there first. You have to build that. So when you think about things, like even if we take SRO officers being in school, and the reform for them is no uniform, concealed weapon. The kids know the weapon is there. The parents know the weapons are there. Then you also have an officer who's the neighborhood resource officer who then knows where your child lives from that school. Do you see how a community who faces very historic trauma with police officers, how that would be considered, like for us, we're like, it's a hostage situation. Like this is not comfortable. This is not comfortable for us. So understanding that even the best intentions, when not done with that background knowledge, can be still incredibly harmful. And that's why we have to have these ongoing conversations and understanding what it really does mean to make a community. And a community is truly based on trust. I want to trust the officers in this community. I want to trust them with my life. You know, that's the goal. And whatever we have to try to get there, I hope that every officer is willing to do that, because that's the oath that they took. Was to protect and serve everyone, regardless of race, color, and creed, and to understand that that is going to look different in different communities. And when we look at this, you know, a lot of times what's good for one community is actually good for the whole community. When we bring up disenfranchised groups, it has a positive, you know, benefit for everyone. So as that relationship with the Black community and police officers changes and actually becomes one built on trust, that will be good for everybody within the community. I think we have to have that conversation.
So then how do we look at SROs in particular, people who are placed in schools? The idea is to keep kids safe, I think, is the intention behind it. Whether that's right or misses the mark in execution or not, I mean, how do we have that conversation?
I think we have to just really have that conversation of what are we defining as keeping our kids safe? That first conversation. So what is
I would say preventing
school
shooting.
So if we're here to prevent a school shooting, okay? So then let's look at that. Why would there be a school shooting in the first place? What are we doing to address doing that? We talk about this before. I talked about this actually at the rally for the library. What are the preventative measures we're doing in the community? Police officers are a reactive measure. Okay, they're there for when the shooter is there. What are the preventative measures that we are taking to make sure a shooter never comes? I would say that within all school districts and how we're doing education, there is a lot lacking there. So I feel like to have that reactionary measure there before you discuss what the preventative measures are, I think that's for me, I'm like, is this making the most, are we starting the conversation at the beginning, or are we starting the conversation in the middle?
Right. Or trying to find the fast fix.
Yes, exactly.
And that right there is a recipe for disaster, in my opinion.
Yes.
If you're going to be results-oriented and focus on, we need to stop this from happening, you're going to go into it looking at all of these potential problem students as problem students, as opposed to students or kids who I can help not have a problem. They're already a problem from day one. And that's what they're looked at.
And that's the other big thing. If we're going to have officers in the school, have we done the correct training with those officers to be of help of Black students and people of color in that school? We have not done that work. So to introduce somebody into that system with a gun and with the authority to put their hands on a child
which is
without
ridiculous.
doing that background, that is just a very dangerous dynamic.
Well, then I want to bring this up too, because my brother was military, and he was saying, a lot of money goes into training our soldiers how to recognize a target. And they to the point where they can, in a split second, if you hold up which one is the target,
Well,
they can say,
military. I know what
that's
you're
the
talking
target.
about.
And a lot of money goes into it. And so some of the arguments that have come out is, or if we defund the police, they won't have the money to get this training that the military has, where they're able to identify a target. Or in general, just that training, the race training, or the training of being in the community. So is that true?
At this? No, it's not, because we have to look about what we're spending money on within a police budget now.
Tanks.
Are they using it for diverse trainings for these things, or are they using it for something different? We have to have that honest conversation. The other thing is, we have to really look about what the training is happening for police officers before they're even on the force. In the state of Wisconsin, if I recall correctly, the legal limit you have to have is 400 hours of training before you're allowed on the force. Then within each community, you can add onto that as you see fit. To be a teacher, and to work in schools, I had to go to school for 4 years. If an officer wants to be in school with students, I feel like they need to have some sort of background in that educational piece. They're not teaching, but they are dealing with students who are going to be in crisis because of different disabilities, different behavioral disorders. They need to have that knowledge. And I'm going to tell you now, a 30-hour course, that's not it. That's not going to give them the tools that they need to do these things. So we have to look at what that training is beforehand. We have to look at, looking at this as I feel, and when we look at countries around the world and how they're training their officers, this is sometimes a 3 to 4 year program where they're doing this at a college level, and they're not just learning about just the rules of their area. They're learning how to do those things where you're recognizing different behaviors. When we look at in the military and things like that, it's also the time. And some of those things, when we look about the cost of trainings, that is also another conversation where we're talking about the cost of schooling, because that should be done. We're civilians, we're not going to be able to do the military training. Police officers are still, they are not military, so they will have to do schooling the same way in which I have had to do schooling and pay for it in the same way. So if we want to have that conversation, then we need to have a conversation about college debt. that's the conversation we have to have, because that's not, you're choosing to be in this profession. So if we want to have that conversation, we can. But it is a different conversation.
Just going back to that issue of trust, I mean, that's the biggest thing. We look for trust in our profession.
Yeah.
It's huge. We look for trust from the safety in the community in which we live. We look for trust from the medical community as well. How can, I guess, from your perspective, just what's that first starting point where we can, I mean, I know conversations are good and reaching people.
I think it's on acting on what we say. If I say we need, if the Black community says this, we can't do this until this piece has happened, then the community of La Crosse has to say, okay, let's see how we can make that happen. It has to be that. It can't be these conversations of, well, that takes too much time, or we need to really think about it. It can't, it can't be this ongoing, they want to have this conversation that lasts for years.
And that's what can it be. We are
and the
on a
problem
timeline,
is,
a deadline.
the problem is every time that we're not addressing this, that is somebody whose life is being affected by this for life. You know what I mean? We are creating these problems for life. So listening to, when the leaders in this community come out and tell you something that needs to be done, do it.
Try it.
Yeah, try it. Give it a shot, because we never have. And if we need to, after we try it, we need to adjust things for the community we're in, then we will do so. But it always kills me the amount of faith that is expected from the Black community of this, when we know these horrible things are happening and we're told
to have faith.
just
It'll
wait,
work.
we're going to have this conversation, not with you, but with other leaders.
It's like, well, why are you
in
leaving
this
us out
echo
of that
chamber.
conversation?
Yeah, and
why
I'm
are we
like,
not, the community who's being affected, allowed in on these talks of change? It makes no sense.
Right, and I will, I think, I was on Facebook, and even with this latest town hall meeting, I won't say who made the comment, because I'm not sure if they would be comfortable with that, but she did make the comment, well, look who's missing, which group is missing from the panel at the town hall meeting. And so when we look at the groups that we have for representation, you have the Black community, you have the Hmong community, you also have the Native American community. Are they being included in these conversations? And our communities kind of stick together. So when I see that one community is being left out of these discussions,
It's the fuss.
Yeah, I'm immediately like,
we can
how
recognize
much,
it's not all
how
about
much
our
trust
one
is then
movement.
happening
It's about everybody.
here? Because if you're not extending that out to everybody, I know that there can be a point where you don't extend that to me now too. So I'm already ready for that to happen.
To piggyback off of Dustin's question, and also to highlight something that was said earlier, in these conversations we've been hearing from different perspectives, we've been hearing the issue is systemic. But in this conversation we heard, well, we kind of need to start at the ground, not the top, because we've been hearing, well, it's systemic, so it needs to be dealt with elsewhere. So it's kind of like passing it off, like passing the baton, like it's somewhere else. I mean, yeah, we see it in our department, but it needs to be dealt with here. So when we're talking about starting at the grassroots, and I think to Dustin's question, where?
Yeah.
So
we do need
they need those answers.
Yeah.
I guess.
So we do need to start, so when we talk about the beginning, we say start, with the people in the conversations you're having. What can ordinary citizens do in their everyday lives to keep this going? And it's having those conversations, it's addressing those micro aggressions. However, then we also have to look at leadership. Leadership has a big influence on how the community is going to respond to something, okay? If, for instance, tomorrow, the leaders in our community come out and they say, we're going to give Campaign Zero a try. We're going to start working on different pieces of it. It's going to be a long haul. It's going to take a lot of time, but we're going to start the beginning process of it, and we're really going to focus on that. Because they are leaders in the community, that's already, for many of your average day citizens, are already going to look, be like, oh, well, maybe we should give that a try. Because they're leaders. In this community, because it's predominantly white, there is trust built between the white population and the police officers and their leaders in power. So they'll be ready to get on board with that. For our community, like the Black community, if they stand out that strongly for something like that, I'm ready to get on board with that, because I'm like, I've never seen that happen before and didn't think, you know, this really impresses me, so I'm willing to be part of these conversations because I see that you're very serious in taking these steps. So we are still addressing those microaggressions in our everyday lives, but we're also taking very strong cues from our leaders. And again, our leaders aren't saying this is going to be the fix. They're saying we're going to try this. And the fact that leaders on such a high level are willing to try to root out racism within their systems makes other people want, you know, it gives other people reason to want to do it as well. They recognize that it's not this scary, degrading process. They realize that it's an okay thing to do. And it sucks that we have to kind of say it's an okay thing to do, but that is the reality we live in. So we really do need leaders to step up while citizens are addressing the microaggressions and leaders are addressing the macroaggressions.
Yeah, I think that's really, unless there's anything else either of you would like to add, I think that's a
No, I think that that's good. Like, I'm just
place to
grateful.
leave it to give us those next steps, hopefully. I mean, to see, again, the goal of these are just to continue the conversations to try to affect that change in whatever way we can to make it a community that's more inclusive.
Exactly. Yeah. No, we were super glad that you guys asked us.
Yeah, thank you. Great privilege.
Like, we were, like,
Thank you
super
both for being a part of this.